Welcome to Protomotive. Have you ever thought about why a Porsche 911 Turbo with a GT3 top end is way cooler than a GT3 with a turbo? Well, we have. We were asked this very question from a client dropping his 911 Turbo off for a big build. It seems like a silly question to entertain, but when you think about it, there's some pretty serious complexities to consider. I mean, how can a high-revving GT3 screaming bite not get your adrenaline pumping? And the whooshing, chirping turbos making mind-numbing torque on a 997 Turbo is enough to make your passenger start grabbing for door handles and uncontrollably laugh or scream. So what happens when we put these two together? Black holes? Space-time warps? Supernovas? Yeah, they're pretty incredible. Let's start with who would do this, why they would, or does it even make sense to take on this mod for each car? Later, we'll get into how you can do this incredible upgrade and what all it would take to upgrade either car to an amazing beast. If you're enjoying our videos, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe so YouTube knows we're here. What does the psychology of the owner have to do with any of this? The psychology of the owner plays a huge part. Enthusiasts buy the GT3 for a specific purpose and are typically opposed to the idea of turbos from the start. They pride themselves on the car's responsiveness, drivability, and consistency on the track, and prefer the sound of the naturally aspirated engine to the turbo.
Before we actually race, we've got to do the customary car wow sound check. So I'm going to rev up this turbo. Sounds a bit like a vacuum cleaner. Let's have some naturally aspirated goodness. That's winning. That wins. That's it. Game over. You won that one. That's definite. Yeah.
On the other hand, a 911 Turbo owner is much more interested in power at all costs. And the modification of the engine internals to GT3 parts is just one more upgrade in a long line of upgrades that a high percentage of turbo owners really enjoy. GT3 owners tend to do more chassis mods than engine mods to improve their lap times, as too much power can sometimes slow them down on the track, since the cars are so well balanced from the factory that doubling the horsepower would radically offset that balance, requiring a ton of other mods to bring that balance back in check. The same psychology would apply to the resale of the car built in this manner. If it was a modified GT3, you would have a limited resale market, since GT3 buyers are predominantly looking for naturally aspirated cars, not a turbo. Whereas a modified turbo with GT3 parts would appeal to a much broader market, albeit a limited one due to the high cost of such a conversion. That being said, either of these would be kick-ass builds most owners would only dream of.
Both? Both is good.
What level of modifications are required for a GT3 when installing turbos? They're missing a few parts. That duct right there flows air up and over the quarter through the intercooler that sits diagonally in the rear, and then it comes out, exits out the rear of the car. A GT3 not having these things has no ability to flow air through an intercooler. Even though the chassis are the same and you can mount the intercoolers and frames up in there, there'd be no way to get air through it. So either you end up cutting the ducts into the rear quarters and changing the rear bumper skin out, or you can install a water meth kit or install water to air intercoolers or something else to provide a different means of cooling if you don't want to cut into the rear quarters and get these cool looking rear ducts. The GT3 would require bodywork and engine work to provide air inlets and ducted outlets for the intercoolers, as well as a framework to hold them. However, if you used an air-to-water intercooler, a low-boost system running E85 or pump plus meth, you could get away without intercoolers and keep the modifications to the engine only. To do it right, the engine would require a lower end with lower compression pistons to run a decent amount of boost. Here's a factory GT3 piston. Notice the dome in the center is quite a bit higher than the turbo piston with a low compression ratio dome. Both of these do have large intake valve reliefs and exhaust reliefs. Both of them are also pretty similar on the bottom. The biggest difference is the dome in there, which allows for a lot more air to be in there. The compression ratio is quite a bit lower on the turbo pistons, and that's where we get a lot of power out of these things. Unless you were running a low boost simple bolt-on kit. However, for such an adventure, why would you limit yourself to a low boost non-intercooled bolt-on? If you're going to do this to a GT3, you'd want to go bonkers on a project like this. Now, what level of modifications are required to modify a 911 Turbo to a GT3 top end? Upgrading a 911 Turbo with the GT3 Top End can be done with engine internals only. Well, almost. You'd want to use the GT3 intake manifold as well, so the air path was correct. Since the 911 Turbo already has a turbo, all the normal turbo stuff still works perfectly here. It's just the heads, valve train, and intake manifold needed to make this conversion. This is overly simplified since we'll be covering this later. Now, why would anyone do this anyway? Both the GT3 and 911 Turbo have always been apex predators, literally king of the hill on the street and track for decades, while the owners and drivers have always been on opposing sides of opinion about which one is king, and therefore considered polar opposites. Even though the 911 Turbo is a fantastic car on the track, the GT3 has always been considered the track car. Although the GT2 RS is quite a bit quicker around the Nürburgring. It's just harder to drive with that much power. So then, why would someone consider this? Well, what a better thing than to take the best from each of the two of the most amazing Porsches there's ever been, in my opinion. But feel free to disagree in the comments. Why not create a black hole by combining the best of two superstars? What are the advantages of a GT3 top end over the 911 Turbo top end? Airflow and RPM are the primary ones. The 911 Turbos rev to sub 7,000 RPM range, where the GT3s scream at 8,500 and 9,000 RPM. Without increasing booster torque, you can take a low 1,000 horsepower 911 Turbo and with the GT3 parts installed, you'll be up 30% already for a 1,300 horsepower package that seems to just never quit pulling. Now here we have a 997 Turbo intake manifold versus GT3 intake manifold. The GT3, we did a bunch of different boost pressure runs on this one. You can see at the lowest boost pressure, it was already around 900 horsepower at the tires, peaking up at, 1334 at the wheels versus the 997 turbo intake. We've only got one high boost run, which I believe they were at the same boost right around 2 bar. This one was running 1224 at the tires versus the 1334. But check this out. On the boost response, here we've got very similar 500-600 RPM different boost response. The low end torque is already up even before the boost is coming in. The boost comes in sooner, the torque comes in sooner. More airflow gives the turbos a little more excitement. They turn on sooner. They make a really nice broad flat torque curve compared to the peaky stock 997 turbo intake manifold. Again, this is two identical engines with a manifold change. So we end up making peak power up here, much higher RPM, 6,900 versus 6,300 on the stock 997 turbo intake. At different boost pressures and different ports and cams and whatnot, you can make very different peak power numbers at different RPMs. We've seen some of these things up in the 7,800 and 8,000 RPM band, but this is just with reground cams, light port work on the intake and stock intake and exhaust valve sizes. So manifold versus manifold, same thing as the 996 turbo intake manifold. Got 500 to 600 RPM improvement on the low speed, very broad torque curve. And this one carries all the way up to 7,300, really nice, whereas the 997 turbo intake is tanking in the high sixes, somewhere 62 to 6,800 RPMs. It's already dropping its torque way off, which makes the power roll over. So really nice comparison here between the 997 turbo intake and the GT3 intake manifold. Yes, you'll compromise the low end with such big cams and ports and lose the docility of the low lift from the turbo top end, but when you're after all-out power, this will get you there. If you take the 1,569 wheel horsepower 997 GT2 we had built a few years back and put a full GT3 top end on it, you'll end up somewhere between 1,800 to 2,000 wheel horsepower without a boost increase.
What did he say?
Of course, providing the injectors, fuel pumps, turbos, and rest of the build can also keep up. Now, what are the advantages of a turbo on a GT3? Well, boost. By doubling the density of the airflow through the engine, you can easily double the GT3's power, and that's only at a bar of boost. A 480 horsepower GT3 quickly becomes nearly 1,000 horsepower with only 1 bar of boost. Now that's a nutty track car. Be prepared to install massive tires and huge brakes, double your spring rates, and get the biggest wing you can to try to tame this wicked beast. Would it be quicker on the track? Well, that would really depend on the track. At Sears Point Raceway in Northern California, bone stock GT3 may be quicker than a highly modded one due to the tightness of the track. But the same car at Road Atlanta or other tracks with high-speed straights and high-speed corners would eat the stock GT3 for lunch.